Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here with another daily movie review in spooky season. It continues. Today we're going to be talking about the 1960 film Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is a 1960 British psychological horror thriller film directed by Michael Powell, written by Leo Marks, and starring Carl Boehm, Anna Massey, and Maura Shearer. The film revolves around a serial killer who murders women while using a portable film camera to record their dying expressions of terror. Its title derives from the slang expression Peeping Tom, which describes a voyeur. So yeah, it's been years since I've seen this. I saw this probably 10, 12 years ago. One just kind of random October night, Turner Classic Movies, back in the day when we used to have cable, before we all became cord cutters, streamers, back in the olden days, the dark times, when you would have to actually show up to a place at a certain time to watch a movie. And I just kind of randomly put it on. I had no idea I didn't know anything about it. I just read the plot synopsis, I remember, and just watched it. I used to do that all the time when I was younger with Turner Classic Movies. All the time. Just go and just watch whatever was on that night, and came across this movie. And it's an interesting movie. It's kind of one of these things that's really way ahead of its time. It was critically derided back when it came out, actually. It kind of got the director, Michael Powell, a little bit blacklisted. He was kind of a prestigious director. He was interesting, very well respected. I mean, a lot of modern filmmakers, of a certain generation, will make notice of him. They talk about how influential he was. Martin Scorsese, Coppola, George Romero even. Because this is kind of the birth of the slasher flick. This was kind of part of a two-hander with Psycho. Psycho came out, I think, a couple months after Peeping Tom did. And it's interesting. Peeping Tom kind of completely bombs, gets critically torn to pieces. It's kind of just looked at it as kind of exploitative trash, whereas Psycho is heralded as a masterpiece, right? And they're very different movies in a lot of ways, but they're very similar in some ways as well. I think the biggest difference is just the style. Stylistically, they're very different, but thematically, they're dealing with a lot of the same subject matter. There's even kind of similar character traits in the main characters. They're both kind of obsessed with their parents and something that happened with their parents that kind of motivates their behavior. And they're into voyeurism. They have kind of hang-ups about sexuality. There's kind of this impotent nature to their characters. So just from that perspective, it's kind of interesting that they come out literally months apart, and the world reacts one way to one and the other to the other. I mean, granted, I think Psycho probably really why it worked was the marketing. You went into that movie knowing that's what you were getting. I mean, they marketed it to be this shocking, disturbing movie. Peeping Tom, I think, had a much more kind of, dare I say, normal marketing campaign. They probably weren't making such a big deal about kind of the shocking nature of the material and the kind of concepts that they were going to be exploring in the movie, because it's very dark. It's incredibly dark and twisted, and it's from 1960, so it's not insanely explicit or anything like that. But even for its time, I would imagine it was probably a pretty risque film, Peeping Tom, in the same way that Psycho was, because it has this kind of casualness about sexuality, and because the main character, he kind of takes pictures, kind of dirty pictures, but he's asexual in that sense. He can't get aroused by that kind of stuff. It just doesn't bother him. He's completely harmless. The only thing that he actually really needs to kind of feel some sort of gratification, I guess they kind of draw a parallel that it's sexual in nature, is watching people die through his camera lens and watching themselves. So there's this kind of meta layer. And I think Michael Powell is kind of implicating the audience in this voyeurism, because we can't really look away. It's hard. You do get some sort of weird enjoyment as a human being watching a movie like this, where these kind of behaviors are seen at kind of a safe distance, right? We can explore our darker natures. And in 1960, exploring your sexuality in this kind of way, the idea that something violent would manifest out of human sexuality was probably pretty taboo. So I imagine if you were a 1960s audience, you go see this, you're in London, going out with the wife, going out with the girlfriend, going to the theater, and you end up seeing Peeping Tom, you'd probably be pretty shocked, I'm curious. I would like to actually look into at some point. Maybe someday I'll do that. Look into what the marketing campaign for Peeping Tom was, because I think a lot of the success of Psycho is expectation setting. You know, like I said, like they just sold it as exactly what it was. But anyways, enough about the parallels, because there's a lot of differences. This is probably more. I would say it's more of a conventional film than Psycho is. Psycho's full of like a lot of gimmicks and tricks and like cool, interesting camera stuff, things that like kind of Hitchcock was famous for exploring. You know, different kind of perspectives. But I will say this about Peeping Tom: it is a gorgeously shot movie. It looks beautiful. It has almost like this kind of, it's like this psychedelic noir vibe to it that I really, really enjoyed. It reminded me a lot, actually, if you've ever seen the movie Point Blank by John Borman, which is not in the same genre as this at all, the Lee Marvin film. There's a sequence in that where there's like a psychedelic 60s freak out sequence in that movie, and this color scheme of this movie reminded me a lot of that. It's just like every color pops. There's a lot of deep blacks to juxtapose like kind of these bright 60s colors. And it makes for a really interesting kind of visual scheme, right? And it's used to kind of heighten the drama, because it feels in some ways they're working in the world of filmmaking and stagecraft, and the movie feels like a piece of that. Like feels like there's a layer of self-awareness to how the movie is presenting itself. And you're kind of experiencing the movie in the same way that the characters experience the movie. So there's like this heightened reality to it, even though it's couched in something very grounded and very real. But we're not often invited outside of the stage. So it has that kind of interesting element to it. And I think it's what makes it so memorable. Like I said, I've been thinking about this movie for a long time. Like I've been meaning to revisit Peeping Tom for years. And I don't know why. Just never got around to it. And I saw that it was on Amazon Prime last night, just randomly. I was just, I have a whole watch list full of like 100 movies. And then I saw Peeping Tom, and I was like, oh, Peeping Tom. Now's the time. Now's the moment. The film was shot by Otto Heller, who did The Lady Killers, Alfie. If you remember Alfie, the Michael Caine movie. Did he do anything else interesting? I'm sure he did. Probably just things that I am ignorant of. It's just like with the director Michael Powell. I'm like very ignorant of his filmography. It's somebody that I really need to go back and check out some of his stuff. I mean, because people cite him all the time. I just wasn't familiar with him, and he was very prolific. Like he's got a really, really deep well of movies, going all the way back from the 30s up until the 70s. I think 1978 is his last, or 1972 is his last feature. But yeah. His first movie is in 1931. So he was a worker, man. I mean, there's a lot of movies in here. So I definitely got to go back and check out some of this stuff. But so don't let my ignorance, turn you off or whatever. I'm learning. I'm trying. Okay. But yeah, so there is like that interesting meta quality. I do think it actually it makes it so memorable you just can't forget it, and it probably is what kind of helped it gain cult status, because like I said, it didn't do very well at the box office. Critics tore it apart, but within about a decade, 15 years maybe, it was critically reassessed. People recognized it for what it was. It started a whole genre. Like I said, it's part of the slasher tradition basically, and I'm not sure there's a better example of the time, and it does it so smartly. That's the thing with something like this. You watch something like Peeping Tom or Psycho even, and those things, like, they inspire all of these kind of shitty movies. And all of those, even the bad ones, those like the later slashers, they kind of, they imitate like the structure and the characters, but they do it in the most shallow, pedantic way. Like with something like Peeping Tom, or Psycho as well, like you really get into the pathology. It really wants you to understand, even empathize with these guys. That's what's kind of unique about something like Norman Bates and what's his name? Mark from Peeping Tom, is that they're kind of the main characters. And the movie wants you to feel what they feel. It wants you to sympathize and empathize, which is not something that's common in a slasher movie, right? At least not in the first one, right? Because sometimes they'll go down, once you get to the fifth or sixth movie in a franchise, then they start wanting to reveal the inner nature, or they also kind of got to this thing where it was like, it's better not to know. It's more mysterious. They're more impactful if you don't know, which I think in the cartoony archetypes of somebody like Jason or Freddy, that is actually true. But they were trying to make kind of more serious-minded character studies with these movies, and a lot of it's embedded in the kind of the popular psychology of the day, of the time. A lot of Freudian stuff. Freud was kind of coming back into vogue, so there's a lot of those kind of elements to the story and to the way they build the character. Like this character Mark, he has this pathology that's built out from when he was a kid, that his dad would kind of like, was kind of a masochist, and he would kind of like torture him while filming him. Everything he did, he was on film. Adds this interesting layer of abstraction to whatever is happening to you or what you're doing to somebody else. Like if you have a camera up, it kind of adds this barrier. It makes it seem kind of fake, even if it really is happening. And you have a character who's grew up like that, and then grew up on top of that, watching himself be kind of harassed and bothered by his dad. It's interesting, and he looks at his life as if it's a movie yet to be completed. Like he thinks what he's doing as a serial killer in the present, as an adult, is kind of finishing his father's work so that he can have closure, so he can stop. He needs to finish the movie of his life, and he's looking for these very particular kind of faces, kind of trying to complete the set of terror, because that's the only way he's ever been able to feel anything, is through watching himself be terrorized. So he wants to see, what do other people look like when that happens to them? And then finally, spoiler alert, in the finale of the movie, he kills himself in the same manner, which he has like a camera with a tripod. And on the end of one of the tripod legs is a knife. And what he does, he like goes up, he stabs you in the neck. So he does it to himself. It's like actually pretty intense. So he gets like his final shot. I mean, he's obviously not concerned if anybody puts it together or whatever, but yeah, it has that kind of interesting quality to it, where it also has kind of like this conversation about the nature of like the art form and what you'll do to complete a project, how far you'll go. Yeah, it's an interesting movie, and I know that it has been critically reassessed, and I know that people do like it, but I don't hear it spoken of a ton, though. It does seem like it's a little bit of a sleeper. But I think, if you ever were to stumble upon it, or if you watch it as a consequence of watching this rambling video, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised, especially if you have an interest in the genre, in horror and slashers. Like if you're interested in where they actually came from, and the filmmakers that pioneered these kinds of stories. I mean, because the seeds are all here, just like they are in Psycho. They're all here. And it's really interesting to watch this and then go back and like kind of watch some of the stuff that came out in the 70s and the 80s, like about, the slasher movies and the serial killers. And, you got the structures can be a little bit different, obviously, because generally it's kind of focused on the victims with those movies. But I think the main elements, like this, they're always kind of obsessed with their parents, so there's always some sort of abuse element to it. It's interesting to see them echo that far, and even when the genres got very cartoony and kind of silly, you can see that this was clearly an influence on people going forward. And it's interesting to be able to make notice of that, and you notice it right away. So it actually helps that I've seen so many like 70s and 80s kind of exploitation, grindhouse, slasher movies, and also the mainstream ones, because you really see it clear as day. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to know more about Zoobox, there's a bunch of links in the description for Facebook, for Instagram, for my personal Twitter. Also, if you'd like to make a recommendation for one of these daily videos, throw it in the comments and we will put it on the list. All right, everybody, you have the best one ever.